Mike, let's dive straight into it because you truly have one of the most fascinating journeys, I believe, on the planet. And so I want to try and get into as much of it today. And I think a lot of our audience will be familiar. Some of them won't be familiar at all. So I'd love to get into some of those details. But can you walk me through one of your earliest childhood memories that you think has had a big impact on who you are today or how you are the way you are today? Do you have a childhood memory or an interaction with your parents or an interaction with a friend or a teacher that you think has stayed with you?
I think when I was very young, I had this love of data and knowledge. My favorite book was the Almanac, and at night I'd have it under my pillow, take out a flashlight, and read it. And my parents had these bridge clubs where adults would come over and come once a month, and I'd have a chance to interact with 15, 16, in some cases 20 adults. And what I discovered in this interaction is very few people ever did research. When you ask a person why they believe in something, etc., they heard it from someone else, and it might be based on fact, it might be based on fiction. And so from a very young age, I began to question why people held certain beliefs, why they made certain decisions, and explore data and information. And I'd say the first major event was discovering that my father had had polio. I had no knowledge, and then one day, a friend that was over, we were playing catch, told me my father had a limp. I really never noticed it. And I was thrust into the world in the early 1950s of what polio was, what occurred, the understanding of it, the fact that in 1952 it was declared an epidemic, and the United States was worried that it would bankrupt the country having to build iron lung hotels to keep people alive. Well, a few years later, there was a solution, and there was a vaccine created. 2 people worked on it, and it became prevalent. But what I also noticed was that teenagers were not taking the vaccine, their parents, because they were worried the vaccine was going to give them polio. And so the end of the story was there was an individual who went on a very popular show in the United States called The Ed Sullivan Show that we used to watch. And more than a year after it was available, less than 1% of every teenager in America had been vaccinated. And this individual's name was Elvis Presley. And because it was okay for Elvis, afterwards, within 1 year, 80% were vaccinated. And so there was a lot to learn here from this. One, because you had a solution didn't mean people would adopt it. 2, the fact that this was considered something that was going to bankrupt the country was obviously proven wrong. Numerous people were affected by it, but I think at the peaks, only 62,000 people. And this has repeated itself throughout history of people telling you the world is coming to an end. It's not going to come to an end, and science coming to the rescue.
Wow, yeah, incredible. I'm so excited to dive into so many of those ideas that you just mentioned there throughout the course of our interview. I want to go back to that position of you starting out. You came from a modest background, and you've had lots of successes and then valleys in your life, peaks and valleys. If you walk us into the direction of your first peak, did you always set out to be financially successful when you first created that first success in your life? What was would you say, the key principles that you used in order to manufacture that first success that you had?
I did not plan to go into the financial service business. I wanted to run the space program. And I was totally infatuated when Sputnik went up. It was a catastrophe if you read the headlines in the United States at the time. There was the middle of the Cold War. Now, quote, Soviet Union had beaten the United States into space. And I was very, very good in math and science. And I wrote a letter to the President of the United States, told him I was ready to run the space program. Now, I never really got a response. I was 11 years old, but that was my plan. And my plan was I went to Berkeley, which was a leader in Nobel Prize winners in the sciences, and I was preparing someday to run the space program. Then I was in Los Angeles, where we are today, during something that became known as the Watts riots. It was August 11th, 1965. And Los Angeles was on fire. The city of dreams, the city of entertainment. I had just been in Berkeley, and we had the free speech movement 6 or 7 months before, but this was different. The city was on fire. And I went and met a young African-American man who told me he would never have a chance to borrow money to have a business. His father didn't because of the color of his skin. It seemed totally irrational to me. And I decided to go back and figure out why this was occurring when I went back to Berkeley and began to study credit. And very similar to when I was younger, I discovered everything that people said about credit was wrong. It didn't make any difference if you're the Secretary of the Treasury, the head of the Federal Reserve, and what they were saying was inaccurate. And so I set on a path. I had to give up my dream at that time of the space program to begin working on what I might have called the democratization of capital. And I pursued that during this period of time from 1965 for the next 20 to 25 years. So that was not my path, but the studying and what I had done as an undergrad and then as a grad student, and my decision to, quote, go to Wall Street was really to redirect the access to capital, have a fundamental change. And yes, in the next 30 years, 62 million jobs in the United States were created. There's always a backlash. As a physics major, for every force, there's resistance. And so changing the financial system at that time, many people wished that I didn't exist. The idea that you were a large company and you had access to capital and the others didn't. So there were 500 investment grade companies and tens of millions of non-investment grade companies. Well, once you empowered them and created financial markets, we discovered 62 million jobs were created in non-investment grade companies and -4. So there was a lot of change. Today, there's hundreds of firms headed by people that work for me. And I would say those structures are the basis of modern financial markets around the world. But it is not unusual. At one of our scientific retreats in the first part of this century, I was in the back of the room and I invited 2 young people from Australia to come and speak. And they commented that everything you thought about ulcers was wrong. Everything they were telling you about ulcers. And these 2 senior scientists I had there in the back of the room, one turned to the other and said, "Who are these yobos? They didn't even go to a good school." Well, 4 years later, these yobos won a Nobel Prize. So challenging conventional wisdom and theory, I think, has been something I've tried to do as you try to move forward, create jobs, solve medical problems throughout my life. And it goes all the way back to my little almanac and discovering my father had polio.
One thing I'm noticing from your answers is that you have this keen ability to spot patterns and analyze patterns. You're almost seeing that there are systems which ultimately are patterns that no longer serve us, and you believe that there are better systems or better patterns that would have an impact on the world. And you also have used the word study a few times in your first few answers. And I think there's this big difference between academic study and pattern study. And I find that the most successful people in the world are great at studying patterns. It's not really about the academic study. Could you help break both of those down for us? Because I feel like you're probably the best person to ask that question to in genuinely understanding the difference, because I think we hear the word study, but when you say the word study, you mean something else.
I would say extremely insightful. So we could say there is inductive reasons, there's deductive reasons. The very first speech I gave on Wall Street was the best investor was a social scientist. Understanding what things were in a bigger world and stepping back. And then going down and looking at the data to find out if your broad ideas of the world were changing. In the last few months, the world has opened up to the idea of where are the children of the world. For 20 years, the handwriting has been on the wall. The world did not open up to it until the last short period of time here. But the birth rate in Northern Asia, Europe, the United States has dropped so significantly that whereas the population of the U.S. has doubled, there are less children born today than there were 70 years ago in the United States. China's birth rate has dropped so low that the number of children born in China last year was less than 10 million. So you think about a country of 1.4 billion, but of average life expectancy, taking those that live to 100 and averaging with those that die young, is 75. If you have 10 million children born a year and you multiply it by 75, that's a population of 750 million, not 1.4 billion. And so as people think about things, we've had more people dying in Japan now for a very long period of time than are born. And so they have a decreasing population. In most of the developed worlds, the birth rate is below replacement, but this has not been going on since the pandemic. This has been going on for a long period of time. And so when do you see it? And so about 20, 30 years ago, became quite concerned because it appeared to us that the future where the children were going to be born was in sub-Saharan Africa. And the rest of the world as a whole might be decreasing in terms of population. So what were the opportunities going to be for the children of sub-Saharan Africa? And today, in 2023, more children are born in Nigeria than all of Western Europe, Eastern Europe, throw in Russia, by a substantial amount. And more than twice as many children are born in just Nigeria than the United States. So people are looking at where you are here. Now, when I had my little almanacs, I was too young to know that if you matched one almanac against another almanac, you were actually getting the first derivative. You were measuring change. And then if you had a few of them, you were measuring the rate of change. And so I think when answering your question, you have to look at the broad social implications and what is occurring. Then you have to ask yourself, do the systems that currently exist fit where the world is going? I then, if I had 4 almanacs, could calculate the second derivative, the rate of change. And I would say this is prevalent in medicine. You could be diagnosed with cancer. Is it a slow-growing cancer or is it a fast-growing? In the case of melanoma, it doubled every month if it was advanced. So 1 billion cancer cells, 10 months later, are 1 trillion. Other cancers are very slow-growing, so you could take your time to address it. And so understanding the rate of change, and today, what's happening in the world and where the children are born and the facts that they're going to need opportunities, they're going to need jobs, or we're going to see 1 to 2 billion people on the move. So the question is, how early do you see that? And one of the exciting things about medicine today is in the 1980s, there was this idea that everything was in your blood. Well, you didn't know what to look for. You couldn't sequence. You couldn't do anything. So might be there, but I can't find it. Now, today, we now have tests that can measure the waste, the DNA leakage in your blood. So you can find a life-threatening disease today when there's just a very small amount of cells in your body long before you could ever find it in a mammogram or a CT or an MRI. And so therefore, dealing with these life-threatening diseases today at their infancy is so much easier. But this was a dream until computers were 1,000,000 times faster and data storage costs were 1/billionth. It was an idea, it was a dream, but it wasn't a reality.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I wanted to, before we dive into all the incredible work you've done in healthcare, I definitely wanted to talk about this part of your journey, which we've talked about personally, but you making all these shifts and changes and pushing the boundaries. You ended up going to prison in 1990 after pleading guilty to several felony charges related to securities violations. But to me, I'm fascinated by A, how that happened for you, but B, more importantly, how you use that time, because the comeback, now looking backwards, it's incredible. But to live that, Steve Jobs famously said, you can always connect the dots looking backwards. You can't when you're moving forwards. I just can't imagine someone who had such a vision, someone who had such incredible ideas to challenge the status quo, ends up having to go to prison. Walk us through, first of all, how did you end up there? And then we'll talk about what it was like there, because I think that's just such a interesting part of your journey now looking backwards.
Well, I think that issue, there was an unusual period of time. And once again, a complete revolution in finance. There are many points in history where you've had people that were presidents, went to prison, Brazil today, and are now the president of the country again. So when the president gave me a pardon, he commented that these things were never crimes before. They've never been crimes since. They related to bookkeeping and things like that. But I had to find a way to bring it to an end. And if you fought for 10 or 20 years, to me, I had to find a way to live again. And so I think if you're true to yourself and you know the issues, and the individuals know you, I viewed this as going to be a short period of time, and I had to cut it short and make a decision for my family, etc., to live again. And it was a short period of time in the scheme of things. When I think of the diversion of less than 2 years, if I go back to World War II, you had people that volunteered and were gone for 4 years fighting for freedom and what they believed in. And so I think my view was that I had to find a solution to bring it to an end. And it didn't really change who I was, what I did. The financial systems we built are now adopted throughout the world, whether you're in India or Singapore or whatever it might be. And yes, there was disruption in the force. I would say to you, if you think about a country you and I first met in, the UK, when the mercantile class rose up in England, who was under threat? The nobility. And so the nobility would go to the king or the queen and say, well, we can't compete anymore. What are we going to do? But the old financial system didn't really meet the future needs of the world. And so, yes, I spent time thinking. I got to tutor individuals, help them get their education.
How did you spend your days for those 2 years?
I spent my time thinking about the world. I would write sometimes ambassadors around the world suggesting what I think they should have done or should do, or what the country should do. So it didn't interrupt those interactions. It didn't stop our philanthropic efforts, etc. I did get to interact with a group of people. At that time, the group that was in the prison camp, this was a very low security area, were primarily there for drugs, marijuana, ship captains, and other types of things. And so It was a period of time I was able to interact with my family. I think anyone that's separated from their family, and when I think back to those people that went and fought in World War II in the 1940s, that might have been separated for 4 years, their only way of communicating with their family was through a letter. The telephone was invented, and in long distance call, when I was young, no one made long distance calls because it was 10 to 12 minutes to call another country. So in the 1970s, if I wanted to speak to Mumbai, I had to be prepared. It was $10 to $12 a minute. So those calls had to be short. And that was a period of time, in that period of time when a person's salary was hundreds of dollars a week, not thousands of dollars a week. Today, people have a hard time relating to that because it's free on WhatsApp or on your phone. But I could communicate with my children, my family. And so when you're separated, the first thought is your family going to be okay? Are your relationships? My wife and I had known each other since we were 12. She knew who I was. I knew who she was. My business associates, thousands of them, knew who I was, knew the issues. And so it wasn't a situation where I felt separated from the world. And therefore communication still existed. A telephone existed. You weren't allowed to have a cell phone, but you could make a call on a payphone. So it wasn't the same separation. When I think of many people that were sent to the Gulag in Russia, there's, whether it was Solzhenitsyn or others or Sharansky, they wrote about how they took away their communications, they took away their visits, they even took away pencil and paper, they took away books, and one of them wrote that he knew he had won then because there was nothing else that they could take away. And so I think having inner strength is extremely important during that period. When I think about my challenges relative to the tens of millions of people that have gone off to fight in wars, my parents' generation that lived through the Depression and World War II so that we could be free, my difficulties were very small relative to theirs.
I think it's an incredible amount of inner strength, not only to be able to navigate those 2 years, even though you are saying it didn't feel that long in the bigger scheme of things. I still believe that there is such a resilience there, but the way you came back.
Well, let's just talk about Mandela. You're talking more than 20 years.
Yeah, 27.
Okay, and did he come back bitter? No. Okay, and in South Africa became quite different, let's say, than Zimbabwe, as Rhodesia went. So instead of being bitter, and when he got out, I had a chance to visit with him. We came to see each other. And so my view was revenge or bitterness is an unproductive emotion. If you have something to give and focus and build, you have to focus going forward. You can't sit and focus on the path. And I had thousands of people that had worked for me who could carry on our mission in finance. And our foundations, by forming the Milken Institute, didn't change much what I had done in the for-profit world there, I now did in the nonprofit world. So my view was the insights, the ideas carried on. And I'm sure, the current president in Brazil, who spent a short time in prison, has certain views, but he has so many responsibilities and things he has to do for Brazil. If he was stuck in the past, Brazil wouldn't have a future.
I'm so glad you brought up Nelson Mandela. There's a beautiful statement of his where he said that when I walked out of the gates of the jail, I realized that if I was to hold on to that resentment or bitterness, that I would still be in prison. and along those lines. And I think that's such a powerful statement of his, that he believed that resentment and bitterness and revenge were the actual prison that would hold and limit him moving forward.
Well, as you know well, and your viewers know well, there are so many people in the world that have mental health issues today. And in many ways, they're all traced to something in their past. And so being free of your past, not forgetting it, not reflecting on it, not having it be part of your decision process, allows you to go forward and to fly from that standpoint.
Absolutely. I want to talk about your switch from financial world to medical research. But before we do that, I want to talk about your own journey with being diagnosed with terminal prostate cancer, which I can't imagine is an easy thing to hear at such a young age as well when you first received that. What was it like to receive such a diagnosis as someone, again, who was thinking about the future, trying to build? Were you someone who was quite focused on your health as well, or were you somewhat negligent because you were focused on work? And how did it feel to hear that?
I would say to you, I probably had one of the least healthy diets in the world until that day I was diagnosed. But I experienced this with my father's death in the 1970s. And it was the first time my economic theories were tested during a period of time from 73 to 77, which I would call my financial clinical trials, all the ideas that I had developed. And by the mid-1970s, I had become independently wealthy with the success of those ideas. And most of them, 90% of the people, believed we were headed to this financial depression again, and my views were, no, we weren't in history. So, but I could not save my father's life from melanoma. And it had a significant view here that it was the first time in my life that I could not solve a problem. I could help rebuild a company. I might be able to help rebuild a country financially, but I could not find a decision. I visited all these senior people, and I went to the major medical centers, traveled with my dad, and I concluded by 1976 that science could not move fast enough, no matter what I had done or could do, to save my father's life. So I had made the decision then to move back to California so that my two children, my wife Lori and I, two children at the time, would know my father before he died. And he died about 9 months after we moved back to California. And then I moved families, etc., thousands of people back to California. And so this has stayed with me. I've lost 10 relatives to cancer, and my diagnosis was worse than theirs. So obviously I'm now reflecting, what am I going to do? And when it looked like I had 18 months to live, you have to figure out, what could I do different than they did? And the first decision I made is I would focus on anything that's reversible. So for 2 years, I did not eat anything except fresh fruit and fresh vegetables. I had no idea whether it would benefit me, but I figured it wouldn't hurt me. And none of my relatives or friends who had died from life-threatening diseases had ever changed their diet. And as I explored the world of the Qi medicine in China, or Ayurveda medicine in India, or witch doctors in the central part of Africa, or Indians in the northwest Amazon, or healers from Russia, it came to me that I would really focus on Ayurveda medicine. And in the 5,000-year history, the belief was your gut, your microbiome, was your second brain. So everything you eat, everything you drink, everything you exercise, everything you're experiencing is going into your second brain. So I was going to change my second brain, even though there was no proof. You couldn't sequence at the time. And so that was a focus that I focused on. And I think the other thing I was very focused on is that most people diagnosed with a life-threatening disease do the least they can do at day one. And if it reoccurs later in life, they do everything they can to stay alive. But if you had done more at the beginning, then you would have had a better chance. And so once I had driven my cancer burden to what appeared to be zero, I then made the decision to have radiation, whereas someone else might have done nothing, because I figured the burden was the least. And so I set off on this journey thinking about my father and my relatives and friends, and I had a bunch of friends that I had interacted with that had passed away, that how could I accelerate science? So first, I could try to change my body. And at this time, we weren't talking CRISPR. We weren't talking about a technology that could change your genes. That is still not widely deployed because we don't know, as we create a new human race, whether this is good or bad. And so I set off on this journey of how to accelerate science. But that journey in science is not much different than my journey in finance or the journey we took in education and what we did. I was going to try to attract the best and most talented people in the world to come work in this field. And no matter how talented you were, if you were the individual that perceived the future was mobile phones or cell phones, Craig McCall, that was a good idea, but unless you had access to billions of dollars, you could never access that idea. Or if you were Bill McGowan and believed fiber optics would change and we could drive the cost over time from $12 a minute to talk to India to zero, you needed billions of dollars. So the same focus of attention. One, attract the best and brightest to work in the field. Two, bring enough financial capital to serve as a multiplier effect. And three, create teamwork. Many organizations have people that have real talent, but they don't act as a team. They don't act as one. And therefore, what I saw in medicine, there was no team. There was not enough financial capital, and many of the brightest people were not working in this field. So those were the first levels I was focused on, but that was no different. In education, we had created a National Educator Award to attract the best and brightest into the field, and finance had searched out the world's leading entrepreneurs, provided them capital and advice, and helped create teams for them. So that was the revolution that began in '93 in healthcare and medical research. And I faced just as much resistance as I did in the financial revolution. The first comment was, prove it. Well, in 1993, you couldn't prove anything. I could show you anecdotal evidence that in places of the world where people were plant eaters, China, not meat eaters, that the incidence of hormone-driven cancers or diabetes was far less. And in places that we had different diets, fast food diet, it was far more. So yes, there was anecdotal evidence, and so they said, we'll prove it. Well, you couldn't sequence the human genome. You couldn't do anything in 1993. And Francis Collins, who I met in '93, set off on a journey to sequence. It wasn't until many, many years later and billions of dollars that they completed that. And I'll never forget, in 1994, I had one of our scientific retreats with the world's leading clinicians in cancer and science. And I wanted to get a Dr. David Heber, who had founded the Center for Human Nutrition, PhD, MD at UCLA, on the program. And the people in charge of the program said, you know, Mike, we're going to lose credibility if we have this soft science ideas that there's some relationship between what you eat and whether you're getting cancer. And they fought me and told me it would degrade what we're trying to build here as the leading cancer research group in the world. And I eventually reached a compromise with him. He would get to speak at lunch. I wrote about it. He would not be on the program. He would not have a microphone, and if you wanted to listen, you had to sit close, and if you didn't want to be infected with this idea that there might be a link to how you live your life and what you eat and what you drink and your health, you could just sit far away and wouldn't have to. 25 years later, Jay, 25 years later, I went to our scientific retreat. I was not in charge of the programming. And maybe 20% of every session over 4 days was cancer and your microbiome. So initially putting forth ideas that challenge the status quo, whether it's finance, whether it's education, or whether it's medical, are challenged. Later, they're accepted, well accepted, and anyone could have thought of that idea.
Yeah, no, it's so fascinating because